Welcome to Go West. Join us as we explore some of Louisville's most unique and overlooked communities. Together, we're going to learn some of the rich heritage of the Portland, Shawnee, Chickasaw, and Parkland communities. During this tour, you're going to learn facts that even for a native, you probably have never known. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this tour. Thank you for joining us. Whenever we talk about West Louisville, the first thing we want to talk about is, why do you think there is a city at this point on the Ohio River? Because let's face it, if you have allergies, it's one of the worst places in the United States to live. Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that when settlers first started moving west, water was the principal means of transport, and the Ohio River was kind of a superhighway of its day. In fact, you could get on a boat north of Pittsburgh and take the river system all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and there was only one obstacle of significance on that entire route, and that was here at Louisville. Because here at Louisville, the Ohio River falls 26 feet over a 2-mile period in a series of rapids that we call the Falls of the Ohio. So that meant if you were coming downriver, you had to stop at what is now Louisville, unload your boat, transport the cargo, yourself, and the boat 2 miles below the falls, reload at what is now Portland, and continue down the river. If you were coming upriver, you had to do the reverse. That was a hard, difficult task, and from the beginning, folks said there had to be a better way. Well, in 1825, they started to dig the original Louisville-Portland Canal. If you have any Irish, Catholic, or African American lineage, that's when those groups first started to come to Louisville in big numbers. It was hard, backbreaking work. They used picks, axes, shovels, and when they hit a boulder or a big tree, they used gunpowder. Anybody that wanted a job could get one, including a gangly Indiana farm boy by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln helped dig the original canal, and that is important because it was the first time that Lincoln saw slaves being manacled and walked down from the Louisville slave markets to be loaded onto boats at the Portland Wharf. He saw families being separated, and that awful scene stuck with him for the rest of his life, and he frequently talked about it. The canal's been modified many times over the last 200 years, but it stands today as a testament to those many unnamed laborers who first built it. Any visit to Portland has to include a conversation about shotguns, because Portland has more shotguns than any single community in the United States. Now don't be alarmed, because I'm not referring to a weapon, but rather to a style of house. And Portland, as I said, has more of the shotgun style than any single community in the U.S. It's one of the most unique vernaculars of American architecture, and like so much of our architecture, it comes from many different sources. In fact, it's considered, many scholars think that the original shotgun design came from the Yoruba people of what is now Nigeria. It was originally called either shogun or togun, which meant house or sacred place. And it was designed specifically for hot, humid climates. That style was brought over by the slave trade to Haiti, into New Orleans, and on up the river system into Louisville. The shotguns across the street illustrate a common design, with one room behind the other. And the one room behind the other promoted ventilation and breezes. The style behind me we call the single shotgun. Behind me is another style of shotgun. As you notice, what's different about this design is you have a second story at the back. More than likely, this house was originally designed for more than one family. Or a family would live in the back and conduct a business in the front rooms. Maybe they made hats, shoes, or some other local trade. Because of the second story at the back of this house, this is commonly referred to as a camelback shotgun. Our third style behind me is much more unusual and rare, but it's also my favorite. As you can see, we have two residences that share a single wall. This style, think about it, we have the single shotgun, we have the camelback shotgun, so this of course has to be a double shotgun. Portland is one of the oldest neighborhoods in Louisville, and it was founded in 1810. We're now near the river at what used to be called the Portland Wharf District. It was a very busy, active district well into the 20th century. Behind me you see mooring rings that would have been in stone down on the waterfront. The smaller ring would have been to tie up a smaller St. John boat or just regular boat. The big chain would have been links for steamboats, which required much bigger mooring. Portland, as I said, was a very active community into the 20th century, but being so close to the river, like a lot of neighborhoods, it suffered an occasional flood. However, there was one flood that was worse than the rest of them.
Police department calling. Police department calling. Urgent. 50 refugees must be moved immediately by boat from 1023 West Madison Street. This is imperative. 50 refugees must be moved immediately by boat from 1023 West Madison Street. This is imperative. 1023 West Madison Street.
That was one of over 100,000 messages sent out over an 8-day period by WHAS radio in January of 1937. Why? Well, it had started to rain, and within 2 weeks Louisville had gotten over half of its annual rainfall. The Ohio River and its tributaries surged out of their banks, quickly rising to 38 feet over flood stage in some portions of the Ohio Valley. All of West Louisville was flooded, and in fact, 70% of the population of Louisville had to be evacuated, creating hundreds of thousands of refugees. In raw numbers, it exceeds what happened to New Orleans after Katrina, and in fact, some historians think it was the worst flood to ever hit a major American city. Now, I could quote statistics to you all day, but I think something that really illustrates the powerful effect of the flood is to walk over here to this post, because on this post is a high watermark sign for the 1937 flood. See if you can find it. And if you're having trouble, it's because, as you can see, it's 22 feet off the street here. There are stories of people coming down this street in boats, and if they got to where they thought their house was, they would stick an oar in the water to see if it was even still there. Unfortunately, a lot of houses in West Louisville and other communities along the river weren't there. It's why today a significant portion of Portland is no longer with us. It literally washed away from the flood. More than any single event, the 1937 flood affected the future of West Louisville. It accelerated some trends, such as suburbanization, that were already occurring. But it was really a point when families who had spent generations in West Louisville suddenly decided they needed to live elsewhere. It's when the potato fields of St. Matthews and the strawberry fields of Middletown first saw significant development. Development which has continued today, and an event that still affects West Louisville. We're now in the second neighborhood on our tour. We're now in the Shawnee neighborhood. As you see, it looks substantially different from the Portland community. Shawnee was designed in the 1890s and well into the 1960s was considered to be one of the most desirable neighborhoods in Louisville. The Olmsted-designed parkways and Shawnee Park, where we're standing, speak to its rich heritage. Behind me is the home of Flora Ponder. Flora was the first African-American graduate of the University of Louisville's School of Nursing. The day Flora started nursing school, she walked in the front door, the dean and several others walked out the back door. Flora later helped set up the Park Duval Medical System, which was one of the first of its type in the United States. Flora's husband, Raymond, was the first black commander of the Louisville Fire Department. Now, the house that Flora and Raymond lived in for many years, and where Flora still lives today, they couldn't have purchased that house when they first set up housekeeping in the 1950s, because this neighborhood, as is most neighborhoods in Louisville, and in fact most neighborhoods in the United States, there were strict prohibitions on who could and could not live in a community. African Americans, and in some communities, people of the Catholic and Jewish faiths, were prohibited from purchasing real estate. Not only could Flora and Raymond not have purchased this house, they could not have stood where we're standing today in Shawnee Park. The Louisville park system was segregated into the 1950s. While the idea of a person being excluded from purchasing a home or even being in a public park by their race was acceptable practice, there were those who knew early on that it was wrong. But challenging this system brought significant risks, as we'll learn in our next stop. We're now in the Chickasaw neighborhood in the 4400 block of Virginia Avenue. Behind me is the longtime home of Carl and Ann Braden. The Bradens lived in this home from the 1940s until Ann's death in 2006. The Bradens were very active in Louisville's community, and they had friends, an African-American couple, the Wades. In the early 1950s, the Wades wanted to purchase a home in one of the nearby suburbs, but nobody would sell to them once they realized that they were black. They talked to their friend, the Bradens, so the Bradens purchased the home, and once the closing went through, they turned around and conveyed it to the Wades. Shortly after the Wades moved into the house, rocks were thrown through the windows, shots were fired into the house, crosses were burned in the front yard, and it culminated in the back half of the house being blown up by dynamite. An investigation was conducted, arrests were made, a trial was held, and jail time was imposed, which is what you would expect when your house is firebombed, correct? Well, that's where the story takes a little interesting twist, because the people charged with the firebombing weren't the people that actually blew up the house. Nobody was ever formally charged with that offense. Instead, the Bradens, people who had acted to help the Wades, were all charged with the crime of sedition. Sedition for trying to overthrow the United States and the Commonwealth of Kentucky because they broke segregation laws and remained active until her death in 2006. And she is a great example of somebody who's very seemingly ordinary doing extraordinary things. Welcome to the Parkland community. We're on Grand Avenue, and this is an area which was very unique for many years in Louisville. It was one of the few places where African Americans could purchase and own real estate, and this was the center of the black middle class well into the 1960s. Behind me, in the pink house, was the home of Cassius and Odessa Clay, and their two children. Cassius and Odessa lived here from the 1940s until Odessa's death in 1994. Their oldest son, Cassius, had his bike stolen when he was 12 years old. He complained to a police officer and told the police officer he was going to, quote, whoop up on the thief. The police officer said, well, if you're going to do that, you better learn how to fight, and invited Cassius to join him at a gym that he ran where he trained local boxers. Cassius participated and did pretty well. In fact, he did so well that he went on to win gold at the 1960 Rome Olympics and became an international celebrity. A year later, he changed his name when he converted to Islam. Muhammad Ali became an international celebrity and a symbol of peace. When Ali died in 2016, his funeral procession went through his old neighborhood in West Louisville, and these streets were lined with thousands of people paying their respects to somebody who became a Louisville legend. Thank you for joining us on our tour of West Louisville. We hope you found it informative and interesting, and we invite you to join us for our future presentations on redlining and as we further learn about the incredible life of Anne Brady.